Dive-In.
Bienvenidos a Dive-In.
Witajcie na festiwalu Dive-In.
Welcome to the Dive-In Festival.
Willkommen zu Dive-In.
Bienvenidos a Dive-In.
Welcome to Dive-In.
Mabuhay sa Dive-In Kapistahan.
Üdvözlünk a Dive-In Fesztiválon.
Добро пожаловать на фестиваль Dive-In.
ברוכים הבאים. בואו לצלול איתנו.
Dive-In উৎসবে আপনাদের সকলকে জানাই সাদর আমন্ত্রণ।
Dive-in'e yokoso.
Benvenuti al Dive-In Festival.
Dive-In Festivali'ne hoş geldiniz.
So welcome everybody to this event, Shine a Light on the Invisible. Not all disabilities are visible. I hope you've had a good day so far and enjoyed some of the other dive-in events earlier. I've loved the sessions I've been to so far today, and I've learnt so much seeing things from another person's perspective, which is actually one of the themes for Dive-In 2020, the other being authenticity. I'll be the moderator for today's session. My name is Heather Connery. I'm Chief of Staff for the Corporate Risk and Broking side in GB of Willis Towers Watson. I'm also co-chair for Workability in GB, and I sit on the Samir I&D Council. I'm a mental health first aid champion, dementia friend, and a disability champion. Today will be a panel event, and we'll cover off some of the main subjects and also then open up to you guys. So as you're thinking about things as we're talking, please feel free to add it into the Q&A box. So enough of me. I now want to introduce our fabulous panel. So perhaps if I could start with you, Mike.
Thanks, Heather. So I'm Mike Ashton. I'm a Managing Director at Willis Towers Watson, based in London, and joined WTW in 2005.
Great, thank you. Barbara, how about you next?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Schoenhofer. I'm the founder of ISC Group, which is a gender inclusion group in the insurance industry. And I have had a long career in the industry as an executive search consultant and very interested in neurodiversity, but that's not where my interest began. It was actually personal with my daughter.
Thank you, Barbara. Travis, an intro from yourself, please.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Travis Gertner. I am with Willis Towers Watson in Seattle, U.S. You can see the sunrise behind me. So good morning, good day, good evening, everybody. I'm also a two-time Paralympic gold medalist. We'll hear a little bit more about that later as well.
Great. Thank you. And last but not least, Sue.
Hello. My name is Sue Godfrey. I'm an occupational therapist and director of vocational rehab services across the UK. I'm looking forward to the event today.
Thank you so much. So we've all done a brief introduction, but I thought we could take a few minutes for each of us to explain your journey and how you got to be in front of the audience today. So let's go back around again. Mike, why don't we kick off with you?
So I've had a busy year. A year ago last week, I was on holiday in Greece and was on a multi-activity holiday with my wife. My wife was involved in water sports. I was going out road cycling every day, having a great time. And I went out on the Monday morning, and around about 11 o'clock in the morning, on a warm down ride, was involved in a road traffic accident, which changed my life pretty significantly. I got a couple of cuts and grazes, but also my back was broken and I got a spinal cord injury, which meant that pretty much from that second I was paralysed from around about there down the rest of my body. So that was back in September 2019, 16th September. Since that date, I've spent around 6 months in hospital. I travelled to various hospitals, first coming back to the UK by plane, went into Addenbrooke's for an operation, then up to Sheffield where they have a fantastic spinal injury unit, then down to Aylesbury to a rehab hospital where I spent a number of months through to the 18th of March this year, so that's 6 months in hospital. And I came out, what we all know now is COVID. So obviously spent the last few months like everybody else in the midst of the pandemic and trying to get some exercise done, trying to get rehab, etc. And was fortunate enough to come across a fantastic physio based in Cambridge, who's worked with a number of other, in fact all he does is work with spinal injury patients and other neuro disabilities, and he has some pretty impressive results, and he warned me at outset that he would be making me work harder than I have ever worked before, which I can vouch for from a sports perspective, having been a keen sports player all my life. And so that is the journey to date, and a couple of things I think which we will touch on later on, but one of the things which really touched home to me was somebody said in no uncertain language, I'll paraphrase it, they said it right at the outset, was don't believe what anyone tells you in terms of the possibilities in life. And so that's been very much something I've followed, and hopefully we'll delve into that over the next hour or so. So back to you, Heather, and someone else to tell us how they've got here.
Sure, thank you so much for sharing that, Mike. Barbara, if I could ask you to just state how you ended up here today.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks very much, Mike, because you know, this is very new to you, and it's very courageous of you to come and share everything with us, because my journey started a very long time ago. It's a gradual burn and not a sudden thing like yours. But I'd just like to share with you something that you don't know, and particularly for Mike, is that my father got encephalitis of the brain when he was actually a Gurkha in the army in the clear-up campaigns after the war, and he had his last rites, and he lived to 83. He had 6 children, I think that was right, or maybe 7, and he was told he would never, become anything, and he did. So that was a start of hope in our family, if you like. But my background is much more around hidden disability, if you want to call it that. I don't like the terminology, and I'll tell you why in a minute, because it started off in the early 70s for me when I had my daughter, my one and only child, and I knew from very early on, as us mums do, that something was not quite right, and I had a battle. She was in state education for her early years and her primary years, and I fought with the educational authorities to keep her in mainstream, because I felt that she would benefit more from that. Because in those days, if you're going back, almost 50 years, it was really educationally subnormal was the term. So if you were educationally subnormal, you went to a special school, and I fought against that. And actually, it was a long time ago, and it's been a journey, and I won't go through the journey with you because things have moved ahead a lot. But there are a couple of things that happened to me which I think are relevant to today, and happened to me as a parent of my daughter Claire. Okay, things happened to Claire as well, but basically what happened to me in my journey with a living experience of neurodiversity was the first time Claire was at secondary school, and I went up for a parent-teachers evening. You know those evenings you're nervous about, etc. And I went in, and as I went in, the teacher was sitting in this big hall. There were lots of other teachers there, and she was sitting at a desk, And as I walked up to her, she started to shake her head. Just like that. And that had a very, very bad impact on me, as you might imagine. I sat down and she said, "You have a real problem." Anyway, after that interview, I went out, I got into my car in the car park and I cried my eyes out. And then I got back, I talked to a friend of mine, actually it was somebody I worked with, her name was Diane Bannister, and she knew my daughter quite well. And she said, "Do you know, Barbara," she said, "have you looked at Claire lately? Have you spoken to her? She's an extremely funny person. She's got a great sense of humour. She's very individual. She hasn't, you know, got a visible disability like some of the others on this call have. You know, she can walk, she can see, she can feel." And, you know, from that day onwards, I looked at Claire, my daughter Claire, in a different way. And I started really seeing her. And so really what happened from there, she came out of that school. Eventually, she went to a private school for severely dyslexic children just south of Disk in Norfolk. And that was a journey. She'd been home educated and taken into another school before we got her to this school. And it was interesting because actually she wasn't severely dyslexic, but it was the only label we could get at the time. And this school took her. And what it did for her is it institutionalized her. And it gave her a routine that I couldn't give her. And so actually from the age of 13 to the age of 17, she stayed in that institution and she got a routine and things worked quite well. And then she came home. And then, of course, it all fell apart because actually she operated very, very differently. And so we had a bit of a journey. And I told Claire I was doing this talk today, and I asked her permission because it's very difficult, isn't it, when you're talking about someone with a neuro difference and learning differences. And she completely understands that, you know, if you out them to their friends, and if friends see this on YouTube, etc., they will hear her story as well. So it's really important to choose the right words here, because Claire went out into her adult life at 21. She moved out and became independent, and we've had quite a journey, her and I, since then. But one of the things that happened was in her early 30s, she came back to live with me. And I won't tell you what happened because that's a private conversation over a glass of wine, so why all that happened. But anyway, she came back to live with me, and my husband, who's not her father, after a while said, "I can't live with Claire because she operates differently and it's just too much for me." So I said, "Well, you know, she's a vulnerable adult and I'm afraid she's going to stay. So if you can't live with her, you've got to go." And he said, "Well, I don't want to do that. Can I investigate further?" So I said, "Of course you can." And so he went and he did a lot of investigations, and long story short, we then got a diagnosis that she was autistic. And David came and told me, I was at work, he came into the middle of the office, my husband, and he told me that she was autistic, and we got that label, and therefore she was registered disabled. Okay? I burst into tears, and he was completely dumbfounded. Why was I crying? We had an answer at last. And for years and years and years, I'd held my ground over her. And to get that diagnosis was absolutely a huge release for me. And when I told her, she said, "But Mum, you told me I was severely dyslexic. So why are you now telling me I'm on the autism spectrum? I don't understand." So we had to then go through a whole thing for a long time about why this was and why it hadn't been understood before. So we've really cut through, and you know, today she's a happy, you know, she's in her late 40s, she lives independently, happy as any of us can be, okay? And with maturity, there comes a calmness and an acceptance. And so what we joke about, we have a lot of laughs, Claire and I, and we joke about things. But that really started my interest. And I'll just finish by saying that actually I couldn't be the person I am. I couldn't be a consultant in the way that I am if I hadn't had Claire as my daughter. So I applaud Claire because she's made me a much better person, because I've been able to look at things in a completely different way from someone who looks through a different lens to me. And actually that's why neurodiversity is so important to our industry.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you as well to Claire for allowing you to share parts of that. And just before we go on to our next panel member, I remember when we first met and we talked about whether we should do neurodiversity under the banner of disability, because it isn't always a disability, is it?
I think it's the important thing to say here, Heather, that I never liked that word disability, because I actually think that it's about difference. And actually we need all the differences that are on this screen, we need if we are going to understand each other better. And I learned this through executive search. We all think differently. We all operate differently, okay? We may be on a spectrum, but we need to have all these differences, whether they're visible, such as Mike's, and we'll hear from the others are, or invisible. The fact is they're differences, and they're differences that we need to know about in order to cope with the new world that we're living in.
That really resonates, and we'll be coming on to labels a bit later, because I like what you say about using the term differences. And so thank you. Travis, perhaps you could share your journey, how you ended up today.
Sure, absolutely. So kind of sharing on the theme of early in life, and I was born without without my lower legs. So you can't see that on the screen today, but I am in a wheelchair as a result, obviously. And really the doctors had no explanation for why that was. So it was just something that was going to be. And frankly, that was an advantage for me. I was forced to adapt from day one to figure out what my limits were going to be. How do I work hard to figure out and stretch what my limits were going to be in life? And having done that since day one has really been an advantage for me as I've grown into adulthood and really negotiated my way through life with that skill set. So again, I've never viewed it as something that, you know, when people say they might be sorry for your situation, I don't, without them knowing more about the situation, that's a very difficult thing for somebody to be saying because they don't really understand what an advantage it actually has been for me. But anyway, through all of that, I really, as I've tried to work hard to figure out what I can and can't do in life and challenge those limits, I've worked to really become the best person that I can be. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how I view sort of that definition of success in life and viewing really being the best person that you could be, that definition. But anyway, through all of that hard work in life and more later, that really led to 2 Paralympic gold medalists in the sport of wheelchair basketball. I was in the Sydney 2000 Paralympic Games and the Athens 2004 Paralympic Games. Again, something that those around me didn't think was possible. And had I listened to the voices necessarily around me, that wouldn't have made it that far. But through a lot of support through other people and a lot of hard work, that came to fruition. But anyway, that was sports, and I've always thought about my journey as more of a well-rounded journey, both physically, mentally, and spiritually. And an example of that, what took me to Willis Towers Watson, is during Athens, when you're around these people across the world and you get to have this opportunity to meet such diverse people. And I took advantage of that, but I was also known to be found to be sitting in Athletes Village studying. I knew that the sports world, especially for disabled athletes, wasn't going to pay my bills, especially long term, with things like a pandemic where you could lose your job. And so that was important to me to be well-rounded. So I spent my time studying for actuarial exams, and that's how I find myself at Willis Towers Watson. I've been an actuary now for 17 years, navigated my way pretty successfully in terms of defining a role that I'm very engaged in, working for a company that I really like to work for. And through all that, when I left Athens, corporate career was important, but also raising a family. So I'm a father of 3, raising my children with my wife, Laura. And so that was, you know, I took a break after Athens 2004 from sort of the competitive international sports world. Then all of a sudden, 2017 came and my competitive bug came back, and I looked at my wife and I said, you know, I want to know what it might look like to go back to the Paralympic Games. And she said, when I met you, you said you were finished with all of that. And I said, well, I think I meant basketball. I'd like to try something different. And so I'm now pursuing a 4-year journey to go back to the Paralympic Games in the sport of hand cycling with Team USA. So I'm on Team USA now. Last year, I was 3rd in the world at the World Championships, and I'm pursuing the Tokyo Games if and when they happen as we work through this pandemic.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then finally, talking about different perspectives, Sue, from your position and where you sit, you've had the opportunity to look at multiple journeys. So perhaps if you could explain more about how you got to be in front of our audience today.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Heather. Yes, my experience is a little different, as you say, less the lived direct experience and more other people's, if you like, through my journey, which started when I qualified as an occupational therapist. I won't admit to how many years ago that was, but initially I worked in the NHS, in mental health services, and mainly in work rehab services, various government projects, work projects, before I moved in the private sector. And then I moved into working with an income protection insurer, where I supported people with a whole range of conditions to return to work or remain in work. And then in 2011, I took the plunge, set up independently, and shortly took over as director of ErgoCom. And now I have a team of health and psychology professionals, and we deliver vocational rehab services across the UK. I've also been a trustee of a mental health charity, a great charity, and I'm currently a trustee of the Vocational Rehab Association. To explain where I sort of come from, I've always focused my energies on helping people to find meaningful employment. I think that we all aspire to be productive and contribute in some way. And I think that's even more so for people who are disadvantaged or with health conditions or differences, to pick up on what you said, Barbara. And I think because there are more challenges and barriers to overcome most often to achieve a more of a level playing field in the world of work. And as an OT, I work in a very holistic way. And I think this echoes what I think all of you said in some way. I'm focusing less on the sort of medical model on disability limitations, and I'm focusing more on someone's ability, what their strengths are, what we can build on. So what I'm trying to do is help people see possibilities and support them to achieve their aspirations and where they want to be. Thinking particularly about the subject today around invisible conditions, I've worked extensively with a whole range of people with a whole range of different health conditions. I just muted myself. That was clever. Yeah, just to name a few: cancer, chronic fatigue or MEs, as probably known, heart conditions, chronic pain, as well as the mental health, and it goes on and on. I won't list them all. So I have a good understanding of the challenges and the issues that people face when their difficulties aren't so obvious to other people. I've supported along the way individuals and employers to address these challenges on their journey, and that is looking at from looking for the right sort of work and what's meaningful for them, and then staying in work when things get tough as well. So a key part of what I'm doing every day, day to day, is helping employers to understand and make allowances for people where the difficulties aren't so obvious. So I'm really pleased to be part of this great event. It's fabulous. It's raising awareness of the issues met by those who I found a phrase which I really liked, building really on what you were saying, Barbara, around I saw the use of differently normal. I think I quite like that. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. Back to you, Heather. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I really like that phrase. Well, I'm just writing it down. So, the event today is Shine a Light on the Invisible. Not all disabilities are visible. So, we will come to the invisible, but what about where they are visible? What does that mean for us? How does that change perceptions? So, I thought what I'd do is probably perhaps if we go back to you, Mike, and just ask you around visible disabilities and whether that's created a barrier for you, and if so, what are those barriers
So I
apart from
guess,
the obvious, obviously?
right. So in terms of barriers, I think people who you meet can sometimes create barriers, and recognizing I've only been in this position for a relatively short period, a year, obviously the number of barriers are reduced, but that said, I think the first barrier came very early on when my family were told I wouldn't get through intensive care, and to kind of prepare for the worst. So as you can tell, I did. And then we met the consultant who, in the beginning of this year, who said he was surprised because he thought I wouldn't be able to hold a drink, wouldn't be able to touch my nose, all that sort of thing. I can assure you I can hold a drink. I definitely can touch my nose. And then you come to more significant barriers where people do have this habit of, Travis may well have come across this as well, that people will make their own conclusions by looking at you and saying, oh, you won't be able to do this, or you won't be able to do that. And they'll also try and help you in certain ways. The classic being somebody opening a door in front of you and actually standing in the doorway so you can't get through anyway. But it's just people have perceptions, I think, when they see somebody in a wheelchair and say, oh, they're going to find that difficult. Whereas actually, I've seen some fantastic things from people in wheelchairs. I have a friend up in Sheffield now, same level of injury, who manages to throw himself somehow into the bath and do everything himself or whatever. And that's great. He happens to be 20 years younger than me, so may have an advantage, but that's a minor point. But I think we, as opposed to looking at things like barriers, it's almost following on Sue's point, where it's actually we just aim to do things slightly differently, maybe different ways of doing things. Kind of the last thing I was told I couldn't do was get back on a bike. Now, last September, I actually vowed never to get back on a bike. But anyway, I have a target next year of getting on a bike, and it'll be a different sort of bike. It'll be a hand cycle. I'm never going to be as quick as Travis, I'm sure. But there are certain physical challenges on doing that. But let's see. Let's try and let's see if we can do them, and not necessarily listen to those barriers that are put up in front of you, because sometimes they're not real barriers.
If I can just add to that, Heather, I think that's a really good point. Disabilities are so vast. And so I hate to say it, but all disabilities are almost different. You can narrow in on one, but unless you're very educated, like Barbara, for example, it's very difficult for you as you approach somebody, even if they're in a wheelchair, to know what that person in a wheelchair can or cannot do. It's impossible. And you shouldn't try, I would say, to approach somebody and pretend you know what they can or can't do, because that's going to put up those barriers that Mike just spoke about. And so it's really about asking and not making assumptions. To the disabled person, I would also say it's very difficult, like what Mike just said, for others to tell you what you can or can't do. And unfortunately, we see a lot of boundaries being put up just because false limits are set when people on both sides of that equation really try and make assumptions.
Thank you for sharing. To be honest, I was going to come to you next anyway, so that worked out quite well. So no, thank you both for sharing that. I think we've already kind of established that even with a visible disability, there are still challenges, but it's about that understanding and perception from others. So when some of the disabilities are then invisible, what does that then mean for us? Does that create more issues or less issues? A lot of people are saying down to lockdown, it's more of a level playing field. So, Barbara, perhaps we could come to you, and we've already talked a little bit about labels and differences anyway, so perhaps you want to expand more on that.
Yeah, I think the thing is that, you know, having been 30 years in executive search, I was in 18 years in a corporate career before that, guys. So actually, I'd done a real job as well. But I was in executive search, and it was really interesting to me when I started to look at the inclusion of women and why it was so important to get the inclusion of women more into the industry. Because actually women have learned through their blueprint changing over many years to look at things in a different way. We just learned how to do it. And so that's really adds value. And then I started looking more broadly at diversity and inclusion. And really what has happened, I think, if we reel forward to now, we've seen massive change in the insurance industry, and that massive change has been partly accelerated by COVID-19 and lockdown, because, you know, 48 hours before it happened, we went into lockdown, you know, we were talking about it was impossible to agile work or flexible work, okay? And now I think even the top bosses are realizing that, you know, real ahead 6 months, we did it in 48 hours. We were creative. You know, we were able to do it. And I think that leads to a great opportunity for the insurance industry to look at things differently and to actually realize by having the Mikes, the Travises, you know, Sue, people like Sue involved, you know, and people who are on the neurodiversity spectrum. And we probably have many people on that spectrum working in the industry already, and probably some of you will recognize in the audience, but it's a big challenge because you've got to understand how people operate differently and what their different needs are, whether it's opening a door to Mike and getting the hell out of the way so his wheelchair can come through, or actually understanding that somebody cannot be what they are not. So if you're expecting someone to react in a way that how you react, you've got to stop thinking of it in that way. And it's a bit like managing people, you know, in this lockdown situation. If you're a leader, how do you manage people? It's understanding those who respond well to emails, those who respond better to a phone call, those who can do Zoom videos all day and all night, those who actually struggle with it, and you begin to see that everyone is on a spectrum of one sort or another, and it's understanding that and then how to help people be the best they are in the framework or the skin or the diversity that they have.
That's lovely, thank you. I think I keep hearing the words understanding, and how we can perhaps help with that. And some people really probably do want to help. But on a slightly kind of jarring note, Travis, I remember when we were catching up a little while ago and you were saying when you were flying, and you fly quite a lot for work, then you would be in the airport and you'd be asked by airport staff whether you're okay, and then ask you again, and then again, and then again. And at a certain point, it's like...
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, because I fly a lot for work, there was many years where I flew 100 flights a year. You get a certain status on the airline. So I would come up to the counter, check in before the flight, at the gate, and the agents would know your status on the airline. And I was the high status just because I fly a lot. So obviously I have experience flying, and they would ask me, do you need help to your seat? And I would say, no, I don't. And it's fine. That's a good question to ask because they don't know. Again, they haven't seen what I can and can't do. They're sitting in a wheelchair, but they don't know that I can get up and go to my seat on my own. But then they would say, are you sure? And they would ask 3 or 4 times. So the point there being, A, you already know I fly a lot. So when I gave you the first answer, I know what I can and can't do, but you continue to ask 2 or 3 or 4 times. And so it's that type of thing that, it's based on assumptions that were made in advance without really seeing what an individual can and can't do in their situation.
Thank you. And it's really interesting because there's so much being assumed from visual labels, but when things are completely invisible, then how do people get help or not get help? Sue, I know when we were chatting, we talked about chronic fatigue, I think, once, and long-term pain conditions. So what are the kind of things you're seeing when you're helping people whose disabilities are invisible? Oh, Sue, we can't hear you. Might need to come off mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, I think obviously a lot of the work I'm doing is helping people go back to work, and I think for a lot of conditions, people are experiencing fluctuations from day to day, and I think employers very often don't understand that, and they sometimes believe that the person's messing about, or because they can't see the issue. I often find that if it's down to a manager who probably doesn't have any awareness of a condition, and I'm thinking of an example of a lady that I supported back to work. And she was supposed to fit into a box of their standard 4-week return to work, which is going to be pretty tough for somebody with chronic fatigue. So I mean, it was really getting the employer, the manager, helping them to sort of get alongside them and work collaboratively with them and the individual, so that the manager could understand what the issues were. I was able to explain things in terms of, well, this is actually evidence-based. This is what's going to help the person. If you want them to come back into work and stay in work, and if you push them too quickly, they're going to go off again, and that's not going to achieve your goals. It's not going to help them. So it was around helping them both to work together. So that, again, it's that word understanding, isn't it? And it's about being flexible. And once the manager understood what the difficulties were, how they were best addressed, and that the person was actually trying their best, that it wasn't something that they could help, that their condition did vary. And I think the fluctuations are a real issue for lots of people. They were also worried about the individual, that the lady I was working with was worried about her colleagues too, because that's often an issue. There's a sort of feeling perhaps that they're not pulling their weight, or they're slacking in some way. I come across that a lot, and that makes it difficult for people to share their difficulties, or to admit to them sometimes, or talk about them. So I do quite a lot of work with people to help them explain their condition to other people as well as their employers. So I think that's one of the most common problems I think I come across.
No, thank you for sharing that. And again, it comes back to perspectives and understanding. I found I was reflecting on how we could organise and get some flow here. And I realise, and I do this every single time, when someone asks me who I am, I will give my name and what I do for a living. And it's so tied to our identity, but this is so much broader than just that work conversation. Mike, I know that we had a discussion on that, didn't we, a little while ago, about identities and work, and not necessarily linking back to work all the time.
I think it's hard to pigeonhole somebody or put someone in a box and say, well, particularly it's been an accident as opposed to something from birth, and say, well, prior to the accident, they did X job, therefore they need, whatever the disability, whatever the accident, therefore they need a certain amount of time off, and then after a period of time, they can go back into that job and they can work from home, they can do such and such. And people can make those assumptions without knowing the full extent of an injury or the extent of a disability. And I speak from the perspective of somebody with a spinal cord injury rather than broader disabilities, obviously, but that spectrum of SCI, spinal cord injury, is huge, in as much as some examples. When I was in hospital, one person came in with a spinal cord injury, a professional rugby player, carried in, and actually I have seen pictures of him since, and he's walked out. Fantastic. But that's a very different sort of spinal cord injury to one where you won't be walking or you'll have other disabilities, etc. And quite often with SCIs, you get those hidden things that are wrong, which are harder, A, to understand, and also harder, obviously, to recognise, and they're not as widely understood. So even within the medical profession, it's been very, very interesting to see that SCIs are such a specialised area. You have hospital units for them. You have medical professionals who are excellent medical professionals but know nothing about them. Therefore, when you look at it from an employer's perspective, think how hard it is from the employer's perspective, regardless of their industry, to be able to understand what an employee is going through or where they're at with a particular disability, when even often medical professionals struggle to understand it. I mean, I don't know if that helps to give some colour to the position, but I think it's very hard to put people in a box.
Can I talk to that, Heather, actually? So what Mike's just said, because looking at it from a recruitment point of view, which I did for many years, and now from a career advisory point of view, I think it's really important to find out who someone is rather than what is on their CV. And I always say to people, tell me who you are. I mean, who you really are. And what I mean by that is not 30 years experience in the insurance industry doing XYZ job. What I'm looking for is, I can share with you, I'm a protagonist. So I shake the cage. Okay, I'm one of those people that I throw an incendiary bomb in and then I wait and see what happens. Okay, and the other thing I do is connect people. So I'm a great connector. I've got networks in all sorts of industries all around the world. Okay, so there are two things that you now know about me that you would not get through reading my profile or my CV. And that's the essence of what we've got to get to here. Who really is Mike? Who really is Travis? Who am I? Who are you, Heather? And who are you, Sue? It's like, then you can start to see what add value. And I like to talk, Mike and I, and Trevor and I, with Travis, sorry, and I talked about this before coming on today, about actually the value to the insurance industry, because we've got a new horizon. We've got a new world happening. We've got new risks emerging. We've got new ways of doing things. We're all starting to think about the well-being of people, whether they are, they have differences, whether those are physical or mental or neurodiversity linked. The point is, we're having to think about everything very, very differently. And because of that, there is a great opportunity. And, Mike, when we spoke, you were saying that, employers and corporates are looking, got a lot on their plate at the moment. They've got, shareholder value to look after, etc. I actually fundamentally believe that the industry can show the way here. Why? Why is the insurance industry so uniquely placed? Because we're all about protection. And actually understanding all the differences, like the differences in your particular area with spinal injury, Mike, understanding what it means to be born without your lower limbs, etc. Understanding if you think differently to the majority of people. Why is that so important? Because actually everything's up in the air at the moment, and we need to look at everything from slightly different perspectives, We need to stay in touch with the customer, ultimately the customer, whether that's a government or a corporation or individuals. We need to understand what the hell is going on. And people will come into their own because they don't have to do a 4-hour round commute to the city now. They don't have to get exhausted in the same way. They can operate their days in a different way. We can all operate and understand and become more understanding. And I think actually the insurance industry is well placed in all sorts of ways to take advantage of this and actually use the differences of people to really make a huge impact and show other industries the way to go, because actually we're getting a black eye about non-payment of claims around the pandemic. It's really because we haven't solved the policies in the way that they've been understood. Of course, the industry cannot carry all of this risk, but have we explained it in a way that our target audience can hear it? Well, I'm pretty sure just with this group of people here, Sue, Travis, Mike, Heather and me, we could look at things and come up with a different idea and a different thought around it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And as I run a number of innovation groups and incubators, and I have to say, since the industry has become more diverse and those where they've got the inclusivity right, that's where we're really starting to see people approaching things differently because they understand other people's perspectives. So thank you for that. I know that we've not been able to tackle lots of questions. Matt very kindly is on the alert for questions, but because we've had so many to keep up with, luckily we've been looking through and making sure that we're covering off all your main points. We've not got much time left, so that there's kind of two things I want to do. First of all, myself and our panel members today, we've all said, look, half an hour is not long enough to have this conversation. We're all passionate advocates. We're all on LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out directly. So keep the conversation going. But just kind of final reflections, I think. And it's what would be your one bit of practical advice to overcome those barriers and to just level the playing field? So perhaps, Sue, if I could start with you on that one, just a quick, short, sharp, one final thing.
I think as I say, I have got some useful advice for people, but I think it is about being creative and flexible and listening and communication. I think in the end it's all down to communication and sharing and being confident in sharing and explaining, because and not being frightened of that, and for employers to allow that and encourage it.
Thank you for that, Sue. Travis, what would be your final bit of practical advice to help level the playing field?
Yeah, I think it goes back to this, setting incorrect assumptions. And so what I would say is every individual is their own benchmark. We really need to help each other and help people in the workplace to help define what they can and can't do. Help them figure out how they can stretch their limits and define what those limits are. And then the definition of success for any individual, disabled or not, is being the best person that they can possibly be in their given situation. So helping learn about the situation, identify potential barriers, work to stretch those limits, and you got to work to do that. You can't just assume what those limits are. Experiment, stretch your limits, define them, and then really be the most successful that you possibly can within a given situation.
That's great, thank you. Barbara, what would be, and especially when you've been advising executives, are you finding particularly that leaders are now not perhaps having the same stigma and limited beliefs that they had a long time ago?
Yeah, I think it's really important, that word stigma. And I would say that the bit of advice I give to all of you in the audience that are listening, that look, in the wake of COVID-19, I and a group of other senior figures in the insurance industry, we formed a group called GAIN, G-A-I-N, which is Group for Autism, Insurance and Neurodiversity. And one of the things that we're doing is creating a hub. It's an umbrella organisation. So people like Sue, we would love Sue to be involved. We're talking to Ambition about autism and other groups to get them involved, to create an umbrella or a hub where employers, where potential employees, where those that are in the industry that are on the spectrum and others can join in. Why we're doing that is because we believe that we can make a difference here. So all of you who have an interest or are on the spectrum, look, it's a safe environment. Come and join us. You'll find us on LinkedIn, and let's do this together.
Rousing, thank you so much. And I remember we were talking about cultural change, and you said a phrase that not made me feel sad, but I think some of the courage that people have shown today and a bit of rousing speech is nothing worth doing is going to be easy. But it's a bit more easy than it was a little while ago. So let's take heart with that one. Thank you all so much. I think it's been a fantastic 60 minutes. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I know we have. Don't forget, we're all on LinkedIn. Please reach out to us and keep that conversation going. I really just want to say thank you so much for our wonderful panel, our amazing sponsors, so Swiss Re, iDawn, and Willis Towers Watson, especially Matt Rydell from Swiss Re, who is not visible but has just been so helpful in designing and setting this up. Thank you. DJ and your wonderful tech team and WebEx support, and you guys for all joining us today. So that's it from me. I think we're coming up to the close. Just once again, thank you all very, very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Dive In.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.